Um, Welcome to our webinar on the huge Fair Funding Review Consultation 2.0. It's a presentation from me and then from Stuart today to go through what was in there. I mean, it was an enormous, great big piece of work. I mean, this a quick summary of the headings we've got to go through today. I'll come back to that in a second, but just as an introduction, I mean, really, it's the consultation that we've been waiting for since at least 2016 when Stuart started the work back in the department, or maybe even 2019-20 when we might have expected it first to come in. So it's been a long way. And was it worth it? I think probably on balance it was. It's a really full, comprehensive consultation paper. There's just about enough in there to model the outcomes in the provisional settlement later in the year. But there are some gaps in our knowledge. Some parts of it weren't very well described, and some decisions I think probably have still got to be made by ministers. So we know quite a lot, but we don't know everything yet. We've shared our methodologies and our modelling with others who are doing modelling, particularly with London councils and with LG Futures, and we've spoken to others in the sector as well. And thanks hugely to everyone in an authority who's come back to me with suggestions, queries, and points to improve the modelling. It's really been invaluable. MXCLG have also offered to review the modellers' models over the next week, and I think there's another meeting of the funding strategy group next week to feed back on that. I don't think we'll get specific feedback on the models, but sort of general guidance about where we may be going wrong, or maybe there are different things that we should be interpreting in different ways. Having said all that, the approach that we've taken is pretty similar now to that that's been taken by London councils and LG Futures. Some differences here and there in terms of data, some assumptions slightly different, which has resulted in some different outcomes, but broadly the pattern looks similar across those three models. And in fairness, the outcomes from our latest model, version 5.16, is mostly in the direction that we expected based on our previous model, particularly 5.15. That was the model that took into account the latest that we had following the December consultation, and particularly the final settlement with the children's relative needs formula. That was the thing that's really moved things a lot over the last couple of months. And broadly, the outcomes are in a similar sort of pattern. For some, the outcomes are more negative than we expected. I think in inner London, that's certainly the case. And I think in some respects, the department's put through changes that are actually more negative for London than I thought they would, and actually you could also argue more negative than they needed to. And there are some surprises as well, particularly in some shire districts. Some I think worse off than expected, and some oddly enough quite a lot better than we expected. So there's something going on there underneath the bonnet, as it were. I think the damping's a really distinctive feature of the way the system is going to work, and the way they've done it with these sort of 2 or even 3 different layers of damping is a clever way of hiding the sheer scale of the changes without people being aware of how much they're actually being scaled back and not getting their gains that quickly. And I think finally at the extremes, there are questions about the financial sustainability of the cuts in funding for some authorities. Some authorities, and we'll talk about this in quite a bit of depth later, could see some pretty big sustained cash terms cuts in funding over the next 3 years. And there must be a question there about financial sustainability. So just flicking back to this is the overview, the structure today. We'll start off with the relative needs and the needs assessment, talk through the rolling of grants and the rolled in funding, the resources adjustment, what the settlement funding assessment looks like and what the gains and losses look like, touch on some of the consolidated grants and also some changes in business rates. And then we'll look at these 3 different types of damping in the system, which I think will be really, really important to what you actually get out of the system in the end over the next 3 years. So starting off with the relative needs formulas, I think we're pretty clear in advance what the RNFs were going to be and which parts of which services would have their own RNF. So adult social care, the changes there are broadly in line with the University of Kent's proposals, although the consultation paper doesn't say that, and I'm not sure we're going to get any further detail about why they've gone with the weightings they've gone with. The children's services formula, major changes there, as we'll see. That's a brand new formula on a completely different basis. We saw that in advance, and we were fairly sure that would happen, and that's really moved money around. But part of the children's services RNF has been carved off into this new home to school transport RNF. This one very beneficial to county areas, those with larger geographies, really distributing funding for homeschool transport based on distances rather than deprivation. Then foundation formula, lower tier, which replaces the environmental, protective and cultural services block, really funding all the universal lower tier services. And from this has been carved off the new temporary accommodation relative needs formula, which seems to be very beneficial to London and some urban Met and some urban districts as well. This seems to be a really important factor, I think, in why some more urban district councils are doing fairly well. Then the foundation formula, again, universal services in the upper tier, replacing the old EPCS block, a fire and rescue RNF, and a highways maintenance RNF. We haven't done the full modelling we normally do on the RNFs yet. We'll do that later in the month. We've really been focusing on what this all means for everyone's funding over the next 3 years. So we'll keep working on that and get that over to you as soon as possible. And I think that'll help us to understand more about how and why authorities have gained or lost from the funding reforms. Obviously, the main driver of change is going to be around changes in needs, but not entirely. And I'm also aware that you've got to get your consultation responses done, so you want to understand what's happened with the RNFs as soon as possible, and I'll get that to you as soon as I can. Of course, there were some RNFs that were deleted, and actually these are, for some people, are actually more important than the ones that have gone ahead. So the ones that have been deleted, principally concessionary travel, flood defence, coast protection, fixed costs. Concessionary travel, particularly important to Met authorities and to some degree to London as well. Flood defence, coast protection, fixed costs, really important for Shire districts. So that's one of the reasons why we see Shire districts needs assessments falling. Capital financing, I think that's a really important control total, a really important formula, and I don't think the government really gave us enough information to justify removing that from the system. I understand why they've done it, but I think it needs justifying more. And then, of course, all the rolled-in grants that we had in 2013-14, some of which will have disappeared into the mist of time and we've forgotten about, but they are important. Things like the council tax freeze grant, remember that? Eric Pickles telling us we'd get funding, but we didn't increase our council tax. Plus homelessness prevention, learning disability and health reform grant, early intervention grants, all these grants which you have been getting funding for since 13-14 because they're in your SFA, they've been entirely deleted. So the change from that will be important for those of you who are getting decent sums from that. So quite important impacts from removing these RNFs, and I think particularly in the case of the capital financing one, not really enough justification for removing them. And then sort of an allied issue, which is the baseline effect, so negative RSG and the 13-14 damping. If you were gaining from either of those two factors, or in some cases from both of those two factors, their removal or their non-continuation means that you've lost out as a result of changing them and taking them out of the baseline, taking them out of SFA. A quick look at the RNFs and the change. We issued a briefing note, I think at the beginning of last week, although time is merging rather. I think it was the beginning of last week. We looked at the changes in RNFs and the change in needs assessments. And you see here in London's share of every single RNF has reduced. So adult social care, particularly children and young people's services, we're expecting an average cut of about 30%. The actual cut looks slightly higher, but it's around that, sort of losing about a third of London's losing about a third of its children's funding. We kind of also expected cuts in the foundation formula, upper and lower tier as well, particularly because of the removal of a lot of the urban related factors. The cut in the lower tier formula, foundation formula, is a bit lower because we've included the housing temporary accommodation RNF in here as well to show the like-for-like change. So slightly less cut here because London does fairly well from that temporary accommodation RNF. The surprise one though was highways maintenance RNF. I mean, we were expecting it to be simplified, but it has been simplified as much as it could possibly have been, and London loses out from that because the urban related factors from that have been stripped out. we had some of that modelling in our modelling, but yeah, I think this is towards the bottom end of that change, or sorry, the top end of that change. Overall needs assessment, when you weight it, down by 14%, so a big cut in funding for inner London. Metropolitan authorities gaining overall in children's, and then overall on the overall needs, but only by 1%, which is possibly a smaller increase in overall needs than we were anticipating. So Met authorities losing overall in adult social care, formula, foundation formula, both lower and upper tier, and also in highways maintenance as well. So really, the small increase in needs assessment for Mets driven entirely by the increase in their share for children's and young people's services. Shire counties, big increases in needs right the way across the board. Possibly a little bit of an unexpected change, and I think certainly when Shire County saw the numbers at the beginning, shortly after the consultation paper came out, pretty happy with that outcome. Ministers have certainly moved quite a lot of the needs assessment towards Shire County, so that's a good outcome, I think, for counties. And the one thing that counties weren't sure of in advance of the consultation was whether ministers would go for the new distribution in adult social care, which is more like the University of Kent work, and they've gone that way, which does really help Shire counties. Shire districts, the key one there obviously for Shire districts, foundation formula, a cut in their share of the foundation formula, and that translates after the weighting into a 25% cut in overall needs, and partly ignore the commentary on the left. But when we saw that, we were expecting a really bad outcome for the Shire districts, and actually the truth is it's been more complicated than that, but certainly the starting point of the needs assessment is not good for Shire districts. And the same thing for fire authorities. For standalone fire authorities, they've seen a cut in their share of the fire and rescue RNF. The other part of the fire RNF, of course, is within the counties and unitaries that have got a fire function, and that translates into a 12%, 13% cut in needs assessment for standalone fire authorities. And again, we thought this looked really bad initially for fire authorities, but that's only part of the picture. So let's look at the weightings. As expected, government's proposing to use weighted RNFs using historical service expenditure, which broadly means using the RO form for 23-24, and in some places using the section, I think it's 251 form, isn't it, nowadays, for education spend for homeschool transport. So using actual expenditures to guide the control totals. I've not checked it in detail, but it looks like they've faithfully used those expenditure amounts to set the control totals, which is, in technical terms, I think that's a good thing. But what you do see here is some big shifts. In particular, there's a big shift of funding into children's services as a result of the big increases in spending there. So in broad terms, you see for children's, that's going up from effectively 16% back in 2013-14 to 26% in 26-27. If you have to include the homeschool transport element in that as well. But it's a huge shift in funding within the SFA towards children's. Another increase as well for adult social care, but a smaller uplift from 33% to 37%. And then some reductions in other places, particularly around lower tier foundation formula, from 12.3 to 11.8. And then, of course, we've also got the increase in share for fire and rescue, which from 2 to 4.3%, and then capital financing completely eradicated from the system. So that was 21% of funding in 13-14. So then what we've got for the upper tier is a small increase in share, lower tier a reduction in share, and for fire an increase in those weightings. So putting all that together, what we got was a big reduction in funding of the needs assessment rather for inner London, a smaller cut for outer London, a small increase 1% for Mets, a small increase for unitaries, a big increase 11% with Shire counties, and then those bigger cuts in funding for Shire districts and fire authorities. But again, that's only part of the story. So if we look then at individual authorities in that range, this is just for upper tier to start off with. You can see there on the left hand side the biggest gains are places like, you know, bigger counties with more rural characteristics. So Warwickshire, Lincolnshire, for instance. The one on the far left is West Northamptonshire, and I've highlighted that just because I'm not entirely convinced about the comparator from 13-14 because it's a new LGR authority. Then beyond that, you've got places, some of the Mets coming in, like Solihull and Wakefield, as two authorities with the biggest increases in RNFs, sorry, in needs assessment. You've got Manchester there. Then you also got places like Surrey and Buckinghamshire. So pretty big increases in needs assessment. You know, those places, you know, Leafy Surrey, Leafy Buckinghamshire getting bigger increases in needs assessment than Blackpool, a place with the highest level of highest IMD score. So, you know, possibly some counterintuitive changes in needs assessment there. Then on the far right-hand side, you've got the inner London boroughs, K&C, Hamilton, Fulham, Westminster in particular, big cuts in funding there. There's an interesting split as well between the big rural county areas. So you've got places like Warwickshire and Lincolnshire doing really well, but on the other side you've got places like Northumberland, North Yorkshire, Herefordshire doing much less well. I haven't really gone into much detail around that about what the drivers are, but I think some of the cause of that is the impact of the children's social care RNF, which seems to do pretty well in some parts, some rural areas, some county areas, and less well in others. So there's a big split there. And then some Mets, you know, seeing some fairly hefty cuts in their needs assessments, and Trafford, South Tyneside in particular, so some fairly big cuts there. Then looking at districts, looking at the change in needs assessment for districts, so you can see there that all the districts are seeing cuts in needs assessment, and some of the biggest, or many of the biggest cuts are in shire districts. The smallest cuts are in places like Dartford, Northwest Leicestershire, and Cambridge as well. But we'll keep an eye on Dartford and Northwest Leicestershire because they're places that actually, in the end, have seen some bigger cuts in overall funding when we take everything into account. Some of those districts with the biggest cuts in funding have been places that are very, very rural. So some Staffordshire Moorlands, Mid Devon, East Cambridgeshire, West Devon, Fenland, etc. I think some of that is because they were gaining so much from the sparsity indicators in the current formula that by removing them, I think they're some of the worst affected in terms of needs assessments. So if we can calculate the needs assessments with some confidence, the next thing to do is to work out what the quantum is that has to be applied to. So we need to work out what the needs assessment is for 26-27, and estimating the quantum that you apply those needs assessments, those needs shares to. And effectively, you start off with the current SFA, the 16.8 billion, and then you roll in a whole load of grants that we know are going to go into SFA. So all the stuff that's in for spending power, plus the homelessness prevention grant, then plus any growth in funding that you think is going to come through from the spending review, which brings us to 23.2 billion. Deduct any funding that needs to be top sliced for the GLA. And I'll come back to that in this. Well, actually, I meant to talk about that now. It's the GLA element here. We've got 802 million, which is the amount that was in the 2013-14 SFA, but we don't know what that figure is going to be. That hasn't been discussed or confirmed. Looking at London Council's model, they've got a much higher figure. They've got 1.1 billion. They may have indexed the 800 million to get up to the current level of funding, and that's basically GLA's TfL transport funding. So that shouldn't be in the general local government needs assessment. And then you also add in the resources amount, which we'll touch on later about how we've calculated that to get to what should say a needs assessment for 26-27 of 70.5 billion. It's not the SFA for 26-27, it's the needs assessment for 26-27 of 70.5 billion. Our model now assumes that all of these, this whole fund, this entire needs assessment, the 70.5 billion, is distributed using the needs assessment. So your share of that needs assessment will be your share of the needs shares. Initially, we thought that lots of the rolled in grants would have their own distribution, but I think it's pretty clear now that everything gets rolled into a needs assessment, then everything gets distributed using the needs shares. So you see here from the model, you can see it's kind of the way we've got it structured is a little bit of a relic of how we initially did it. But you can see there that we roll in all the funding within SFA. We effectively add onto that the resources deduction, and then you can see all the other amounts there: the BRS surplus, the cap compensation, NX grant, etc. All that funding also gets rolled in as well. And you'll see along the top there it says total needs assessment share. What we've done there is we've just distributed all those rolled in grants using your share of the needs assessment, your needs shares, in other words. So for some of you, you might be surprised to see that, say for Ada there, you've got a share of the local authority BCF grant. That's simply because we're rolling it all into SFA, all into the needs assessment, and then giving you a share of that whole pot based on your needs share. So it's not that you're getting that grant, it's just that it's rolling into the overall global SFA, and it's distributed using the needs shares. But now I'm keeping this structure in place. I know others have modeled it slightly differently. They have shown the overall amounts in global terms and then distributed it. And I'm just keeping this open just for now, just in case there are one or two grants that do get distributed differently from that, and we can show that separately if we need to. I think over time I'll probably change to just having that global approach. One other thing I didn't mention properly is that you'll see there in the amounts that are rolling into the needs assessment, into SFA really, is the BRS surplus 1.5 billion and the cap compensation funding 2.7 billion. So essentially, as a result of the business rate reset, the amount of funding that authorities were getting for their business rates and their above business rates income now gets rolled into general funding and is redistributed. You'll see here it's redistributed pro rata to your needs shares. Now there's one grant that is an anomaly, and I'm not entirely sure we've got the right approach, and it's caused a little bit of trouble. And part of the reason for that is that the explanation of what's happening is not particularly clear. So they want to make sure that the local authority better care grant continues as a separate standalone Section 31 grant. It says here the distribution of the grant will be the same as the updated settlement funding assessment. Does that mean you will get that grant based on your share of SFA, based on your share of needs, or based on the new adult RNF? It's not clear. I can see why you do need to have a continuing Section 31 grant, but then it says we propose the updated grant will be funded via a top slice of social care authority allocations of RSG. So my interpretation of that is that you roll the LA BCF grant into SFA using the needs shares, as we've done on the previous slide, and then you pay out every authority's settlement funding assessment in three elements: the baseline funding level, the RSG, and then you deduct from RSG the amount that you'll get paid as a separate Section 31 grant. That's how we've approached it. So you roll everything into SFA, including the LA Better Care grant, and then you distribute that based on what you would get with indexed BFL, and then RSG to make the balance up and deduct Section 31 grant from the RSG. But there are different ways of doing it. Is the Section 31 grant payment that you actually get from that top slice based on the current distribution or the new adult RNF or some other basis? Other people have thought that it means that the Better Care Fund grant remains entirely outside SFA, so you don't roll it in at all. You just distribute the funds for that grant separately. Is the LA BCF or BCG rolled into SFA on the same basis that it's paid out, i.e. using the new adult RNF, in which case we'll need to think about a different distribution within that rolling in for the LA BCF grant. We just don't know those factors, and we hope to get them cleared up in the next week. A few questions as well from authorities, particularly shire districts, about unexpected increases in revenue support grant. So for many shire district councils, our model's got really quite substantial increases in RSG. And what are the explanations? I think there are probably four we could look at. For some, it'll be partly the result of an increase in the share of SFA, so an increase in needs share, for instance, or at least in overall SFA, none have got an increase in needs share, but some will have benefited from the resources deduction. So you may have got an increase, naturally got an increased share in SFA. Grants have been rolled in, so the grants that you were previously getting in core spending power, recovery grant, NHB, minimum funding guarantee, effectively that funding's been rolled in to SFA, and you've got a share of that, so it uplifts the overall quantum. But I think the two biggest ones are, of course, you getting a share of the business rate surplus and cap compensation funding. So that the 1.5 billion of BR surplus plus the 2.7 billion of cap compensation, instead of getting that normally as part of the BRS, you're now going to get that through your SFA share. So there's another £4 billion, more than £4 billion worth of funding that you're getting a share of, and getting that through RSG. And also there are various adjustments for what's called phased damping, which we'll see later. So any losses that you're getting from SFA off of the overall funding reforms are phased in over time. So you get funding coming back to compensate you for 2/3 of the losses in year one, 1/3 in year two, and that affects your RSG. So it effectively gets paid through RSG. So we can look at that in more detail if you're interested, but effectively there are some good reasons why RSG may have jumped up by more than you expected. Apologies, that slide should have come in a bit earlier. So let's move on to the resources deduction. So this is effectively the part of the formula where we do council tax equalisation, and the resources deduction is based on each council's share of notional council tax. So it's not your actual council tax, it's your share of notional council tax. And the way we work that out is we start off with your actual tax base per CTB1. We deduct second homes premium. In other words, you don't get equalised on any additional second homes council tax that you're generating. We deduct the pensioners LCTS. That's a mandatory amount of discount that you give to pensioners. So that's deducted based on actuals. And then the government estimates what you should be deducting for working age LCTS local council tax support scheme payments, and that's based on a formula. So effectively what they're doing is saying the amount that you should be deducting for working age LCTS is a combination of your population weighted IMD score multiplied by the proportion of your population that's of working age 18 to 64. So it effectively gives you an estimate of how much the government thinks you ought to be deducting. Clearly, the actual amounts are almost always quite different. And then deduct a collection, well, apply a collection rate of 100% to every authority, so you don't deduct anything for non-collection. So effectively, it assumes that everyone collects all their council tax. The issue with that is that some authorities will say we don't collect as much as that, we can't, and that should be reflected in our share of the notional council tax. Government's view is that they want to encourage everyone to collect everything, which is kind of fair enough. So that gives us a total estimated resources deduction of 38 billion. I think different organisations, different modelers have got slightly different approaches and come with slightly different numbers, but I don't think any of us is that far off one another. It's a similar-ish sort of figure, around 37 to 38 billion. So looking here at the relationship between resources and needs, and this is kind of a guide to whether you gain or lose from equalisation. If your needs to resources ratio is high, in other words, you've got a much higher share of needs than your share of the resources deduction, then that means you gain from equalisation. So places that are gaining the most, notably Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, metropolitan authorities that got high needs and a low share of the national tax base. The first London boroughs coming in are places like Barking and Dagenham, but then you've got quite a few. You've got a few of the more urban Shire District Councils, so Norwich, for instance, Crawley, but also Cambridge as well. So they're places that will do well from council tax equalisation. They may have lost from some of the needs assessment changes, but they're gaining from the resources adjustment. So there's some quite big movements there, and beneficial changes for some of those Shire District Councils, particularly more urban ones. And that's something we need to look at in a bit more detail to understand why some shire districts have done well from the changes and some haven't. Then places like Wakefield, North West Leicestershire, you can see Lincolnshire doing very well from the needs assessment, but in the middle of the pack when it comes to resources and council tax equalisation. Then the far right hand side there, you see the authorities that have got the lowest share of needs to resources. In other words, they've got a really high share of the national tax base and a low share of needs. You know, Surrey, right, I think it's, Richmond upon Thames is right at the bottom of that range. They've got the lowest share of needs to resources. And Surrey, then places like Windsor and Maidenhead, Buckinghamshire, K&C. And slightly higher than that, you've got some places coming in like York, Warwickshire, North Yorkshire, Westminster, etc. Some of the certainly some of the more rural county areas, North Yorkshire and Warwickshire, for instance, they're places that won't do particularly well from what they'll lose as a result of council tax equalisation. Not hugely, but it will not help them. So now let's start to look at how all this gets put together and what this looks like in terms of gains and losses, because you've got to bring together the whole range of all the changes. So changes in grant funding, changes as a result of RNFs rolling grants in, but also changes as a result of the business rate reset as well. So the method, just very briefly, the methodology we've used is we've compared 25-26 core spending power plus your local business rate income, so your local retained business rates, and compared that with a new 26-27 SFA, which includes all the rolling grants and your share of all the business rate return surplus. And we scaled that back so the total amounts are like for like between 25-26 and 26-27. And if you want to see the calculations for that, that's in the SFA 26-27 tab, columns DB to DH. Different ways you could do it, but this is the way we've done it, and it gives a fairly simple answer. Looking at the class level, you can see some huge movements. So you can see the bulk of the losses are in inner London, down by 836 million, and the losses there range from 20 million in Tower Hamlets to up to 108 million in Wandsworth. So some huge cash terms losses right the way across inner London. And really the gains elsewhere are largely being funded by what's happening in inner London. Metropolitan authorities are up by 916 million, so a big uplift in funding for Met authorities. The largest increases are in Birmingham, as you expect, 133 million, Manchester 155 million. But 6 Mets have got cash losses, so Gateshead, Sefton, South Tyneside, Sunderland, Trafford and Wigan, losing in overall terms. The losses for those authorities are not nowhere near the sort of scale we see in inner London, but nevertheless, 6 Mets are losing. And then in terms of the unitaries and outer Londons, those with similar characteristics to the Mets typically are gaining. So there's some pretty big gains in places like Hounslow, Hillingdon, Croydon, for instance, as well as other outer Londons like Enfield and Havering. So quite a lot of the big outer London authorities are gaining quite substantially. If we look at county areas overall, so looking at both tiers, overall losses in these areas down by 297 million. For shire counties, the loss there to the increase in needs assessment has been converted into a 115 million pound loss, largely as a result of resource equalisation, council tax equalisation, and bigger cash terms losses for shire districts even than the shire counties. So that's a result to a large extent from the effect of resetting the business rate baselines for shire districts. Shire districts were doing very well from business rate retention, but there are net losses of nearly 300 million for county areas, which may have implications for LGR over the next 3 or 4 years. That's something we need to investigate ourselves over the summer and look at what impact that might have on the proposed unitary authorities, but that's not a good starting point for LGR. The net position is broadly neutral for standalone fire authorities. So the reduced share of needs assessment is offset by the baseline reset and rolled in funding. So that really horrible position from the needs assessment, the big losses there for fire converted into much smaller losses for combined fire authorities and a very small uptick for metropolitan fire authorities. Then finally, the losses in the GLA, I think they look a bit too big. When I put this slide together, I thought that looked a little bit too large, and I think we probably need to go and revisit some of the numbers within the GLA, particularly the top slice. Possibly that is too low, and we need to put more back in there. But the GLA will lose from the baseline reset. It's got a lot of above baseline growth, and it may we would expect it to lose something from that as a result of the changes. So again, similar sort of format, looking at the gains and losses, first of all, for upper tier, a really clear split here. If we look at the left, the biggest gainers Middlesbrough. A lot of the biggest gainers are metropolitan authorities, Manchester, Blackpool, etc., Birmingham, Solihull too, Wakefield. But within that, there are other outer London boroughs as well that have done really well. A lot of those, you would say, they have similar sort of characteristics to Mets. So places like possibly Hounslow or Croydon, for instance, similar sort of characteristics. Then you start to see some decent sized gains for shire counties and county unitaries as well. So places like Lincolnshire, Northumberland, and a small increase there for Warwickshire. But then we start to see some losses for some county areas that we kind of noted earlier. North Yorkshire, Herefordshire, for instance, not doing quite so well on the RNFs, particularly not doing well on children's, and I think that's possibly the thing that's split somewhere like North Yorkshire away from somewhere like Northumberland. I think it's to do with the children's formula. I think then we've got Trafford and South Tyneside. Some of those Mets that are losing out from the overall changes. Kind of expected Trafford would be in that position, but I think somewhere like South Tyneside has done less well than I thought it would have done. And then on the far right, you've got some very high tax-based authorities losing: Buckinghamshire, Surrey, and also Richmondshire. And then on the far right, the splurge of red for the inner London boroughs, Hammersmith and Fulham, Westminster, Cairnsea, and the others in that grouping as well, doing really badly, really big, over 30% losses as a result of the changes. So some big movements there, and possibly bigger movements than we expected. Then looking at the gains and losses for shire district councils, what's interesting here is that the gains and losses go right the way through the distribution. So we've got some shire districts that have got some of the biggest gains across the whole of the sector: Harlow, Norwich, Worthing, Crawley, Fareham, Epsom and Ewell, Lincoln. Typically shire districts with more of an urban set of characteristics, and those at the bottom end losing the most. Places like Harborough, Cherwell, West Oxfordshire, Rugby, places that have had a huge amount of business rate growth and losing very heavily indeed from the reset. But there's a really wide range of gains and losses within the shire district council class. A quick review of some of the business rates issues. Of course, we know there's a full reset in 26-27, but the effect of damping means those gains and losses are damped over 3 years. Funding for cap compensation gets rolled into SFA and distributed pro rata to your needs shares. The enhanced 100% BR arrangements, the pilots, have not been confirmed yet outside Greater Manchester and West Midlands. So we're still waiting for decisions on the pilots in the West of England, Liverpool City region, Cornwall, and the GLA. We understand decisions haven't been made yet about those pilot areas. The future of business rates pools is also unclear. I think the department's view is, do we do them again if they're likely to be less attractive in the early years because you retain growth is less? Changes in levy rates might make them less attractive, and more unitaries might make them less relevant as well. So do they do them again in the future? We understand there won't be a further business rates consultation paper in the autumn, but they will issue papers. I think they're going to make them public as well, which is good, on the proposals as they get developed and to keep the sector up to date. So keep your eye out on what's happening over the autumn. We'll keep you briefed as well, but we don't expect a full consultation paper. And also, we're not expecting any changes in the tier splits now. Certainly in 26-27, and I don't think over the 3 years either. I think they're only going to start discussions with strategic authorities about including them in the BRS from April 26 onwards. So that's something for the future rather than for the immediate near term. We've got these new concepts of consolidated grants, which I think is a good thing, trying to where things aren't getting rolled into SFA. We've at least got these sort of 4 pillars of consolidated grants where similar grants can get put together, and we can get paid them in a consolidated way. So homelessness and rough sleeping grant, so that'll start off with 65%, the non-TA element of the homelessness prevention grant. The 45% is going to go into SFA. I'm not sure what other grants will get rolled in there as well. Public health grant will have its own consolidated block, and it talks about other service specific grants being rolled in there to create a wider public health grant. We've currently assumed no change in distribution for public health, and they haven't mentioned it at all. I think got one mention as part of the ACA weighting within the consultation paper, but I don't know whether that means they are going to change the distribution or not. Let's see. I've assumed no change. A crisis and resilience grant consolidated block, including discretionary housing payments and household support fund, and then the children's family and youth grant block, which will include children's social care prevention grant and children and families grant. I don't know whether they will change the children's social care prevention grant or keep its current distribution. I think we've kept the current distribution, but we may have to apply the new RNF. So we'll do some work over the next week to update the model and sort of change the formatting so that these consolidated grants kind of are a bit clearer within the MTFP tab in the model. So that's obviously going to be an important feature of what happens over the next 3 years. Okay, so let's look at damping. So type 1 damping, I've called type 1, type 2, type 3 damping. The first one is kind of these blended allocations. So it's the idea of gradually moving a local authority to your updated funding allocation over the 3 years and blending the changes in. The approach we've done is, as we mentioned earlier, to estimate the gains and losses that we talked about, and then to apply 1/3 of the losses or gains in 26-27, 2/3 in 27-28, and the full impact of those changes in funding in 28-29. As I said, you can see what the calculations look like, and you can also see the impact of switching on and off the 3-year phasing by there's a drop-down list in the systems assumptions tab. So the way we've done it, I think, is fairly simple, but I think it kind of gets to the right answer. The alternative method will be to completely recalculate SFA in 26-27 and 27-28 with 1/3, 2/3 of the RNFs applied. It's a lot more complicated. It may come up with a different answer. I think at least one of the other models takes that approach. We've gone for the simpler approach. It's a bit easier to understand and doesn't take up too much more space in the model. But we'll see whether we need to do something more complicated and see if there's any feedback from MHCLG on that. But what's interesting about doing this phasing in is it does the damping. It does a heck of a lot of damping, but you don't really see it because there's no scaling back. There's no specific damping payments. There's just a scaling back of changes. The bulk of the damping, as we can see there, is in year 1. So on the right hand side, £1.3 billion worth of damping by scaling back in year 1, and 600 million in year 2. Clearly nothing in year 3 because you're applying the full extent of the changes, and most of that damping will go to London, particularly to London. 802 million over the 2 years. For the GLA, 522. But as I said, I think the GLA numbers need to be changed. And once we'll see, the phase damping does most of the heavy lifting in years 1 and 2, and it does kind of hide. It kind of hides the damping, which is quite clever, I think, because it allows the government to smooth the changes over 3 years quite precisely without the gainers really seeing what they haven't got. So hopefully, from their point of view, reducing any complaints from the gainers about not getting their increases quickly enough. The second type of damping, type 2 damping, is this 0% funding floor, this cash terms, flat cash funding floor. So in other words, after you've applied the phasing in of the SFA changes, you then calculate a funding floor and fix it in cash terms. So you take account of or you make an assumption about how much additional council tax an authority can generate based on the maximum Band D uplift and tax-based growth, and also increases in grant funding that are naturally coming through the SFA as a result of increases in funding in the spending review. And you just make sure that no authority has a cut in funding that's greater than zero. Broadly, the principle is that the government's trying to apply is that authorities will receive any income that authorities receive now will be taken into account in the baselines in 26-27. They haven't fully bottomed them out yet, but that's the kind of the guiding principle. So in the baseline, we've included effectively all the funding streams that you got within core spending power in 25-26, including council tax, and then we've added onto that the retained business rate income that you were getting in 25-26, the 1.5 billion. We've done it after the safety net, after the levy, and then we've added on any above baseline cap compensation payments, and also added in what you were getting in the current year for homelessness prevention grant. So that gives a damping baseline of the 69.4 billion that you were getting in core spending power, plus a further 2.5 billion from the business rate elements and from homelessness prevention grant as well. So that's how we calculated the damping baseline for the 0% cash floor. We've not included any gains that you were getting from the business rate pools. I think the departments kind of concluded they're quite hard to calculate where those gains are actually falling, which is possibly reasonable. And we've not included either any gains that authorities were getting from the 100% business rate pilots in Devo areas. I think they're still considering that, but I think it's pretty unlikely. So if those elements are put in, that means that the funding floor is much higher, and the protection that you get from the 0% funding floor is much greater as well. So the damping baseline does make a significant impact on the amount of damping you receive. But the problem is, as we'll see, it puts you too far above your 29-30 funding target if you're losing from the funding reforms. A 0% cash flat floor doesn't get you anywhere near your target for 29-30. And you can see here that it still distributes a fair amount of damping, 268 million in year one, 556 in year two, 826 in year three. So you can see that the payments from this damping floor actually increase over time as the phasing in of the gradual 1/3, 2/3 gains and losses comes through. So it's actually distributing more in year three than in year one, which is slightly odd. And as I said, the two problems, it's still distributing a lot in year three, and it doesn't help those authorities who are losing get closer to their target funding. So this is the thing that I think some of you will be wrestling with, because you've had an email from the department, and basically it says that a small number of councils whose new funding share is furthest from their current funding share, i.e. those that are losing the most, there'll need to be a conversation about supporting them to manage larger losses. And really what this means is that these authorities are going to need a funding floor, a damping floor that's below the flat cash 0% floor that everyone else will get. As we understand it, in this group there are 41 shire districts, 1 outer London borough, and seven inner London boroughs. We understand they're not releasing the names publicly because they're concerned that their modelling is still quite sensitive and it can still move. They're still making decisions and adjustments, so the people on the list may change. So things are not set in stone yet. So they'll need to, I think, and this is the meeting I think you're all going to on Friday next week, there'll be some kind of funding floor that's not set at flat cash. What that would be is quite hard to actually calculate, because I think that they'll need to take into account what the impact is of your above threshold Band D increases, especially for those with below average Band D, how much reserves you might be able to use. So there are quite a lot of factors to take into account. Our modelling predicted about 37 out of the 41 shire districts, but there were 3 on the list who haven't really lost out in our modelling, and 1 who's not on the list, which is, so there's possibly some issues there about what the criteria are for inclusion, or whether there are some changes we need to make in our modelling to make sure that our model predicts exactly what MHCLG is seeing. but it does suggest that there will be lower funding floors for probably about at this stage about 50 authorities, particularly in inner London, and that will require some kind of scaling back to get those authorities. But actually, that's put for those authorities who are gaining from the whole system. That means there'll be less scaling back, which would be put for them would be a good thing. So just quickly, just going through some examples. So for Wandsworth here, you'll see there the red line shows their pre-damping funding falling hugely. The yellow bars showing you the amount of damping payments we think they'll be getting from the 0% floor, and you can see the dotted line that their post-damped funding total resources stays pretty high. So they're not getting towards their funding target in 29-30. Damping they're getting in 28-29 is still worth nearly 40% of core spending power. So our view is they'll probably need to give Wandsworth a lower funding floor, maybe the -7% funding floor that people have been talking about. If that was the case, then that's the kind of trend line that you would see in Wandsworth about what they would get as a post-damped figure to get them towards that target in 29-30. And you can see that quite a big reduction in the amount of damping that Wandsworth will get. So down from 78 million in 28-29 to 22 million in 28-29 under the -7% floor. Then looking at North West Leicestershire, so this is an authority that's got a huge amount of business rate growth, so it's losing hugely from the baseline reset. The damping that it's getting in 28-29 from the 0% floor is 53% of its core spending power. So again, I think probably to get North West Leicestershire to its 29-30 target, I think it probably needs a 7% or -7% funding floor as well, and possibly even a little bit more. And then you've got some authorities, and Bolsover is an example where the damping is not huge. Their losses weren't that big either. So here, their damping payment in 28-29 is worth 10% of core spending power. So a lot less than Wandsworth and North West Leicestershire. But as you can see, with the 0% floor, they're not getting any closer to their 29-30 target. So again, they will need, I think, a lower baseline, possibly only -2 to get them to their target. You see there that gives them a trend rate that gets them to 29-30 fairly quickly. So their thoughts about what that might mean for the meeting that you're having on Friday with the department about different funding floors. If you want us to work through options with you, just contact me and we can do that. If you want me to update the model generally with different funding floors, either when they've been proposed by MHCLG or based on our methodology, I can do that. And if any of you are going or have been invited next Friday, want to have a pre-meeting, I'm happy to organise one, even if it doesn't take much more than the form of a therapy session. And just to underline as well, I think these outcomes are likely to change over the coming months, and I think they're quite sensitive to decisions taken by ministers. Very quickly before I hand over to Stuart, just to let you know, there are some assumptions within the model you can change, and it's just really to emphasise that things are still a little bit fluid. They're much more locked down than they were a month ago, but there are still some things that we don't know about for sure. And Stuart, over to you. I apologise, I'm a little bit late handing over to you.
No, not at all. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Stuart.
Great. We can probably stop the slide sharing if you like. That's better. Thank you. So here we are to paraphrase Danny Boyle 7 years later. So this is the last major consultation before the provisional settlement, and the signals are that could be certainly November, could be as late as December. Who would bet against that? It's certainly going to be late in the year. It's going to be after the autumn statement. And what that means is it's necessarily a short consultation, and it falls late in your budget setting process. So with that in mind, the first and most obvious thing that strikes you about this consultation is that it's a consultation on financial allocations without proposed financial allocations. As Adrian has hinted, for me this is very much Groundhog Day. The clue is in the name, FFR 2.0. It's an echo of the work that was done under the previous government. And the overall sense is we're simply continuing the work that they started and failed to complete. We're nothing to worry about, nothing to look at here. Let's just do the task that was set for us. And indeed, what we've got is substantially the same approach as was set out in the 2018 consultation paper, with a few updatings where things have moved on or new data sources have become available, and of course updated data in the passing years. Plus, and this is quite important, the exercise of ministerial discretion, which is likely to be different from how it would have been had the previous administration operated it. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. As Tony Travers has said in the chat, the thing that's distinctive about this exercise is that basically nothing has happened on this front since 1314, and that has two immediate consequences. The first is that in that long delay, much has changed on the ground. So you are all in a very different position, whether it's costs or population or so forth, than you would have been then. And the second thing that's changed is that in the interim, we've seen a series of government's tactical funding decisions through no less than 7 one-year settlements, which have often taken authorities further away from the position that's proposed now than you were when you started. Both of those together mean that large changes can be expected from this very overdue exercise. That said, there's much that's welcome here, and I do think the government needs to be congratulated for grasping this nettle, but also in the approach, the general approach that's been taken, and the way that updating has been done. It's a fairly sound approach, together with a shout out for funding consolidation and simplification in support of a more devolved approach. There's much more to do, but it's a step in the right direction. But why have we got this rather odd approach of a very long and wordy document, but with no hard numbers in it? Well, the answer that's given is that government is inviting views on funding, simplification and transition, and those decisions will be taken at the provisional settlements. I mean, I would have thought when you consult somebody on something, you really ought to tell them exactly how it will affect them. There may be more plausible reasons for this. First of all, this process would have started long before the totals in the spending review were finalised. And the time from the spending review is insufficient to publish a very different consultation paper. It would take some weeks to work through and agree those changes. Second of all, as we understand that the work is incomplete, decisions are outstanding, thinking is ongoing, particularly around funding provision and the simplification agenda. Of course, if you were cynical, you would say that the absence of numbers avoids debate and gives the department some plausible deniability and leaves scope for manoeuvre towards the provisional settlement. And you might say that was quite convenient at the moment. So you add to this kind of strangely DIY or privatized approach where it's left to Adrian and others in the field to do their best to make educated guesses and try and model the likely outcome. But inevitably, and Adrian made that very clear throughout, this has got significant limitations. We're operating in a vacuum here. The data will be updated before the settlement in some cases. There's decisions still to be taken, and of course we're in the midst of a consultation. On the consultation, we're on a very tight timetable. Government's trying to do this basically in a calendar year from last December to November or December this year. And that means a really heavy load on this consultation with a lot of interacting decisions to be made. So a change in one area will have significant knock-on effects in other areas of the consultation document. So before we dive into the document itself, just a quick flip back to the December consultation, which was mostly about objectives and principles. And those were very similar to the ones we put forward in 2018 and were confirmed in this document. And the overall thrust is towards simplicity and an evidence-based approach. That's the robustness principle, but clearly subject to elements of ministerial discretion. So that's immediately sets up, if you like, the values of the review, but also creates a tension, I think, between simplicity and transparency on the one hand, what is easily understood, and robustness on the other hand, which is using the best available and most advanced economic and statistical techniques. There was also a lot of rhetoric around co-development and partnership. I'll leave it to you as to whether you feel co-developed in this process. But we should give a shout out to funding simplification, both specific grants that are rolled into the settlement, which begins to correct a picture that got very unbalanced between a relatively small core settlement and big specific grants attached on it, like oversized baubles on a Christmas tree. Also 4 large consolidated funds. We don't know much about them yet. The composition, amounts and distribution will all be done at the provisional settlements, but it is certainly a step in the right direction. And then the final and belated execution of New Homes Bonus, which had basically run out of friends. Also worth mentioning, reduced bidding and funding conditions and reporting, and an interesting reference to outcome-based accountability, which will be central in defining the government's view of the relationship between central and local government, quite how that is framed. So on the main elements, the RNF package, I think, is a reasonable package based on sensible criteria. But as Adrian says, there's no real evidence-based reasoning there. It's basically, we've heard all these things, this is what we think. I would mention specifically the adults and the children's formula. Both of them are much improved over the current versions. It's surprising in the way we got away with the current versions for so long. But they do raise this tension between simplicity and transparency and using the best available techniques. It's not possible, certainly on the children's formula, which is based on confidential data, to understand those from outside. On the area cost adjustment, again, much improved over the current version at local authority level, was used in large part in the COVID allocations, but with a new element on remoteness, which will help rural authorities. The control totals include an amount for business rates retention reset. And as Adrian said, that is a full reset, which is an example of an illustration of the use of ministerial discretion. It is plausible that previous ministers would have gone for a degree of reset which is less than 100%. This set of ministers have decided to maximise the resources that they allocate according to the needs formula, but that means significant losses for many authorities. More generally, on this and other business rates retention proposals, we can see a theme of less emphasis on the incentives and more emphasis on relative needs. Labour are not quite so bought into this system as their predecessors were. Moving to the resources equalisation or tax-based equalisation, again, an example of ministerial discretion. This was at the level of around about 85% in the previous outing in 13-14. Ministers have decided to move it to 100% equalisation this time round. That commanded a minority of support in the consultation. Only 1 in 4 of those responding were in favour of 100%, 2 in 4 were against, 1 in 4 with no view. Those who were against talked about undermining local discretion and accountability, destabilising, less of an incentive to grow tax bases. Ministers would suggest that going for 100% means all authorities can provide the same level of services to their residents, irrespective of their ability to raise council tax, which I think for them is quite a powerful argument. Transition, quite a complicated three-pronged approach. The SFA phasing is a hard stop at 3 years, which allows ministers to say the reform is essentially complete at that time. But there is, of course, a funding floor, and the baseline is unclear as to quite what that is at the moment. What's also unclear is what the cost of that will be, and in particular, what kind of cliff edge there'll be at the end. And then you've got your third prong, which is the bespoke prong. For example, for the GLA, which I always assumed would have to be done bilaterally, not just for the transport bit, but for all the other functions that the GLA does. There's no comparable authority. There isn't a formula that can deal with that. But also outliers, a bespoke approach for those large outlying authorities, perhaps involving council tax flexibilities where their council tax is below the average, the use of reserves, or even capital flexibilities. So finally then, potential outcomes. Well, the first thing I think is obvious is that it depends on your specific circumstances, both where you start from and where you get to under the new formulas. In any group of authorities, whether it's counties, Mets, whether it's northeast, southeast, there's a huge range that's we're likely to see within that group. And this is complicated by the fact that this is essentially a work in progress. There are pending decisions, there are consultation decisions. Flat cash for an authority over a 3-year period is a very challenging outcome. So none of what I'm about to say is meant to take away from that in the slightest. But I think it is clear, without detailed examination of the numbers, that ministers clearly decided not to do issues that they might have done if they wanted to show more favour towards the traditional base, and in some cases decided to do the opposite. And why was that? Well, I think there's some significant constraints on the whole process that suggest a balanced outcome is a better outcome for the sector as a whole. The first is there isn't much money for implementation, so you can't have big winners without having big losers. The second is that the whole sector is under financial resilience stress, so you can't be bearing down disproportionately on a given group. The third is local government restructuring. So again, you don't want to create authorities that have financial problems in the future. The fourth is the timescales for implementation. So they're really pushing this through at quite a rate of knots, and then a fast transition to the end of the spending review period. So always conscious of the risks of judicial challenge. And the final is the priorities for political capital. The joys of a large majority is that you've got representation across the country, so not just in Labour's traditional heartlands, and you have to have that in mind. Do they really want to have a massive fight on this, or do they want to try and minimise the fight that there will inevitably be? So in conclusion, I think there's many things the sector should welcome here, but we have to acknowledge this is painful medicine. Thanks.
It's brilliant. Thank you very much, Stuart. I think we'll open it up to questions and comments. I know, Tony, if you're still on the line, thanks for the comments you put in the chat. I don't think there's anything you want to say about what we've seen today.
Well, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, first, I'm in awe of the enormous amount of work Pixel has done on this. I just think it's and I know London councils, and you mentioned others have done work, but I mean, without this work done from the outside, none of us would have any idea what the redistributive effect would be or the impact on individual authorities. And I do think relying on this way of doing it is not best practice. That's my personal view. Nobody has to agree with that. I think the government should have produced indicative numbers, even if there was a range of them, in order that it would be possible to judge this kind of change. And I think the fact that they haven't does raise, and Stuart hinted at this, I mean, the government has to behave reasonably in relation to every individual authority. And I think I can say that this level of redistribution is without parallel, okay? Over the decades, it is without parallel. And the particular impacts on some authorities have no parallel. So, which is not to say there won't be improvements. You know, in no particular order, there needed to be an uprating of the 2013-14 decision to freeze it, which was itself was poor public administration. So we can all agree on that.
Yeah.
I can see that the very wide differences in council tax, which have long been a problem, this is going at some level to address that, but it's a very odd way of doing it. It's a very odd way of doing it. So I think that, you know, for most authorities near the middle of the gains and losses, it looks like a normal RSG settlement as they used to be. But for the outliers, as I say, I don't think anything quite like it's ever happened before in terms of the scale of the redistribution. And that's partly because it's catching up from 2013-14, but it's not only that. And as you know, my final thought is that all RSG type, all local government funding settlements are a mixture of brilliant technical analysis done by experts and political decisions. Yeah. So this is the result of a political set of decisions moving alongside expert statistical work on how needs should be measured and how resources should be equalized. So, you know, we'll wait and see, but it's going to be an interesting autumn is all I'll say.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tony.
So well done, Pixel. Well done, Pixel. I just can't, I'm in awe of the excellent work you've done here.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Thank you. Thanks, Tony. I mean, I agree with you in that it's the scale of the change is huge. And for some councils, I think most of them would have been aware that something was coming down the line. I think they'd have had inklings even if nothing came from the department. I think in some respects, what's been more difficult for some people is those that have gained or were expecting to gain. To be clear about what those forecasts would be, I think you have to be quite bold. If you thought you were going to gain 10, 15, 20% from these, which some people have, you know, to put those in your budget and actually think about spending well, you wouldn't do it. It's too bold.
But that's my point. I mean, I just think whether you're a big gainer or a big loser, any finance officer who'd gone to the council in the last budget round saying, you know, we're going to plan on the assumption of this wide range of possibility, couldn't have done that. You just couldn't have done it. And that's why the fact that councils weren't informed that this was the scale of likely redistribution, I think again it's not best practice.
Yeah, and I think as well the process leading up to the consultation was even more opaque. Papers were distributed to a group. They weren't supposed to be shared. We weren't supposed to have seen anything. We did see all of them, but we weren't meant to see anything, and that didn't help. And the papers themselves were very thin. They weren't backed up with numbers or anything. So it's very poor. Also, I think that the thing I've never seen before is what's happening to those 50 authorities who will need a below cash floor. It almost feels like is it going to be, you know, is it going to be almost like a manually estimated floor for every authority, or will they have a formula to do it? I just don't know. I'd be fascinated to know. And
I'll shut up here, but some elements of it look arbitrary. That's the other thing. Some of the decisions that will have to be made as a result of the scale of the change will leave government effectively making one-by-one decisions, and the finance system isn't supposed to operate like that. It's supposed to operate as a system, not with arbitrary decision making. Now, it's true that the Section 114 notice and all of that has added a degree of the arbitrary, but this will simply make that more likely, I suspect.
I think it has, and I think it's that the arbitrariness is tricky, and I wonder whether there are some potential challenges. I think Andrew Liverpool said, you know, should this have come with an equality impact assessment? I thought the government was crazy about doing an equality impact assessment wherever they did anything, but how have they assessed what the impact is, the financial sustainability, the impact on, you know, on services?
I think what we're seeing in part here is a blending of the regular system and the EFS system. EFS over time has become less exceptional and become a way of managing difficult circumstances. And actually, I think we mentioned on these webinars 6 months ago, was it likely that we would see an EFS type response to significant outliers in this process? And it looks increasingly so.
Yeah.
You know, the authorities, such as those in Inner London with historically low council taxes, which, as Tony says, dates back a very long way, will be encouraged and allowed to raise council tax, I would guess, in order to dig themselves out of this hole in a shorter period than any damping exercise would allow them to do. And put another way, that will be a reason for central government not spending transition funding on Westminster and Wandsworth. They'll limit the amount of transition funding that they get. I would guess, this is all speculation, to a certain threshold, so let's say -7, and below that threshold, if for the losses between there and wherever they end up, they'll have to fund that themselves, and a lot of it will come from large council tax increases.
Yeah, that's going to be the biggest change, I think, in some ways, seeing as council tax go. One thing I should just clarify, and apologies, I wasn't very clear in the presentation, that the meeting that the department's called for next Friday is just for those authorities who've been contacted. That, as you say, Sam, it's the 41 districts, the 8 London boroughs, who will need support or will have a different baseline, and it's just for those 49 authorities. If any of you, and I'll send around an email tomorrow about this, if any of you do want to have a separate Teams call before that to talk about some of the issues and some of the modelling in detail, I can organise that for us to have that. And Stuart, maybe if you wanted to come along as well and give an idea about how the civil servants might be pitching that meeting, that I'll try and make that happen next week if that would be of interest to you.
They better have a way of putting everyone on mutes in that meeting.
That would be good. I'll just run through some of the other questions to see what we've got. Peter Conwell saying previous versions would rolled in children's services prevention grant but not homelessness prevention. I have changed it in the modelling, as you say. I think I misread the consultation paper initially. The children's services prevention grant does stay outside and goes into the consolidated grant, not into SFA. And then the homelessness prevention grant, that's something I picked up from I think London councils, as well as from the LGA as well. That's their assumption about how that'll get modelled. So the issue there really is about what proportion of the homelessness prevention grant goes into SFA. I think it's 45%, but I just need to confirm that. Lindsay asking about the rationale for changing the shares of sorry, I've lost it just for a second. Lower tier share. I think it's just driven by spending patterns, as simply as that. I think it's just a technical change, Lindsay. And you could argue that just because the sector's spending more on social care doesn't mean, say, the funding should necessarily follow it, but that's the methodology they've got. It's not a manual intervention or really discretion. I think they've done that properly, Stuart. Would you agree?
It's exactly what we proposed in 2018.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Sam asking about, just confirming, thanks very much, that everything will be rolled in and allocated on a needs share. And does that mean that Manchester's losing the benefit of equalisation on the social care grant? Yes and no. It does mean that you lose the equalisation benefit you've got in that grant specifically, but what's happening is the equalisation is taking place generally as a result of the resources deduction. So in theory, you shouldn't lose the benefit of that. It just takes place in a different place.
It's only done once.
So it is once, yeah. And I think that's the issue about the grants that stay outside of SFA, like the LA BCF and the BCG and the children's social care stuff. Do they strip out the equalisation element within those grants when they stay outside of SFA? My guess is that they should do, because Stuart says equalisation is taking place within SFA now, but we don't know And again, Lindsay asking about EPR, the extended producer responsibility on packaging remaining outside SFA. I assume that it is. It's not mentioned. My view is that it's actually not a grant anymore from 26 to 27. It's just income from organisations. It's not grant funding. It's not guaranteed. I know they've kind of hinted at it, or it might go in the baseline. It might not, but I'm assuming it doesn't. It stays outside. Yeah. Andrew asking about, yeah, you're right. I probably should put a deduction in for the empty homes premium as well. I think that should come out of the resources deduction. So I'll make that adjustment to the model as well. Thanks for that. Sam Manchester asking about whether the gains and losses takes into account loss of BR growth in the 100% pilots like Greater Manchester. It doesn't. I've just got the 50% scheme in there. At the moment, Sam, I'm just assuming that all the effects of the pilots and the effect of resetting the baselines in the pilots stays outside, the damping stays outside the whole system, but they could yet bring it in. I don't know what you think about that, Stuart.
Oh, sorry, I was thinking about something else.
Okay. Yeah, the pilots, I'm assuming that at the moment they're outside.
Yeah. Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's worth pushing that, Sam, with the department. I don't think they've closed their minds to it yet, as far as I can tell. But it's not a. I think it's probably unlikely, but it's not impossible. Just shifting through. So go on,
the
Stuart.
empty homes is a discretionary discount, so authorities won't be penalised for charging it. Is that right? Have I understood that correctly?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's the idea. I think it was like the second homes premium, wasn't it? That you can obviously you can choose to charge it, but you wouldn't get the equalisation wouldn't include it.
Anyway, sorry. That's
I'll double check that, Andrew, as well. I'll see. I think I should be deducting it as well, but I'll have a look. Then Gareth asking about what are expectations around council tax equalisation continuing. I think the question here, and correct me if I'm wrong, Gareth, I think what you're asking here is that the assumptions for council tax equalisation need to be updated for each of the next 3 years. We've just based it on the 26-27 numbers, and you're right, we will need to take into account what the growth is going to be in tax base, and that will increase the effect of equalisation in future years. I think the issue for me is that on the other side, we need to put population change into the need side. The two things probably need to be done together. So I might update the model so you can look at what equalisation does over years 2 and 3, but you do need to do that alongside the population numbers as well. That might be a December thing. Sorry, Simon responded on the EPR stuff. Just checking up. Is anything else? Is there anything else that I'll put the slides on the website straight afterwards. I'll Peter's asked for the workings. I'll put them on the website as well. Oh, pardon me. Nick just saying about the changes may be relatively small across the whole sector, but have significant impact on authorities most severely impacted. I agree. Particularly the case around flooding, coastal, but also winter maintenance, adjustment highways. I think it's a really good point. Small things can have bigger consequences if you're the one that was really getting a lot of it. And I think that's the side effect of simplification. It works for the sector as a whole, but you can get outliers that are badly affected by it. I agree with that, Nick, and I think that's probably for those authorities. That's possibly where you could put some more pressure back on the system, just to have some of those factors brought back in. I think it's probably unlikely, but I think, Stuart, that's somewhere where you've got a reasonable case to make. Yeah. Great. I think we're probably there. I think we're probably all exhausted. Oh, Lindsay, you ask a question.
Hi, Adrian. Yeah, I do have a question, but it's specific about Sherwood District Council in the graph that you did on estimated gains and losses.
Yeah.
So I did want to ask a specific question about us. It was just that because we are at the very bottom end, and I just wondered, is that all Shire District Council? So we virtually are like the third worst off council in that graph.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Well, on that basis, anyway, that's right. There's only Harborough and Mid Suffolk that's got bigger cuts.
And is that saying we're losing 30% of core spending power with a reset on top? Or
that's including the reset.
That's including the reset.
Yeah. So I suspect for you, most of that loss is reset rather than funding and needs change. I'd imagine. Okay. Yeah,
powerful graph. I think we need to show that.
It explains why you've probably gone to the meeting on Friday.
Indeed. Yeah. Oh, I'm glad we are going. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Adrian.
Cheers, Lindsay. Cheers, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. Yeah, happy to have a chat outside is easier, but obviously you brought up Tower Hamlets on one of the slides, £20 million loss, I think it said. Looking at the model, it seems we've got a £16 million increase in funding on the bottom line. I don't know whether it's my user error or there's something more technical underpinning these sort of differences. So like I say, happy to have a chat is easier, but I don't know whether it's something that might be relevant for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. We can certainly pick it up outside, Chris, but I think there's the numbers that I put in the presentation are literally the like for like gains and losses from the funding changes. Of course, there are other things going on within the actual funding that you'll get in the model. So you've also got an increase in council tax, you've got tax-based growth, you've got Band D increases, so your starting point is the 20 million loss, but then you're building up against that council tax increases and also funding increases from core spending, from spending review uplifts in funding. So I think for you, it's you're losing something from our estimate 20 million from the funding reforms, but then you're getting growth in resources, council tax and SFA that kind of offset that and give you a small increase. I'm assuming that the £16 million increase for Tower Hamlets is a lot less than you've had in previous years.
Yes, it is a smaller amount, I think, from the model. So, it's not as good, but it's 3.2%. But obviously, it was larger in past years, but it was still better than potentially we're looking at 20 million reduction, but we're actually getting an increase overall. So it's just helpful to piece it all together, but perhaps a discussion.
We're happy to do that. Yeah, I think it's one of those things where you're one of those authorities where you're losing, but your growth in things like tax base kind of like lifts you, from underwater to above water, really. I think it's the truth. Yeah. But drop me a line and we'll put something in the diary.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Cheers. Okay. I think we're probably out of time. I think there are one or two things that have come up. I think Maria from Norfolk. I'll pick up the LGR thing with you separately, and more generally, anyone who's interested in LGR will pick that up separately as well. But for now, thank you everyone for your contributions and for coming on to see us today. And we'll be in touch very shortly. Share the slides with you, share the recording, and see you soon. Thank you very much. And thank you, Stuart, as well. If you saw on Tony, thank you too for Tony Travers and everyone else who's made a contribution. Thanks.
Thanks all.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.